Alright, so back in the office here at Hofstra. This day, April the 10th, 2014, going to read what is Phenomenological Meditation number 57, still in chapter 4 from Being and Learning, and the material that was written this date 10 years ago appears as pages 91 and 92 in chapter 4 on the allegory of the cave, and we continue along with that. Now, today's one of these days that's kind of a strange coincidence, and I didn't realize it until I got the material out to read it, that I make a shift in the writing, which is part of the deal, and on this day 10 years ago I started the meditation by talking about, and I guess I'm going to move into, Arendt's Crisis in Education. Now, the coincidence is that I just finished teaching that essay in my undergraduate class, the Philosophy of Education course. So that definitely catches my eye and caught my attention as I was about to begin reading, or just got the material out. And it was, again, another coincidence and I don't even know why this keeps happening, but again, back in the office, and I had to pull out material, the original printout, because page 101, which is what it was in the binder, was missing from the copy. So let's get started. In her essay, Crisis in Education, Arendt makes the rather stark distinction between education and learning. Learning, she says, can go on to the end of one's days without, for that reason, becoming educated. Because, quote, one can quite easily teach without educating, unquote. Setting aside the question concerning the merits of her distinction, we embrace the analytic framework she offers in order to explore the first part of the allegory, specifically the asymmetrical relationship between the prisoners and their captors. Whereas Arendt's view of learning does not retain the ontological character, her understanding of education is grounded in the ontology of human freedom. To borrow the old Cartesian formula, for Arendt, we are free, therefore we are. We are free, therefore we are. In turn, as we said above, the essence of education is an expression of one of the basic elements of the human condition, or for Arendt, the basic character, natality. We are free, capable of action, of spontaneity, of making new beginnings, of co-creating the plurality that signifies the horizon of beings as a horizon of beings, because we are beginners. To be human is to be a beginner, an initiator, a maker, builder, creator. We are free. And this is why Heidegger speaks of our being possessed by freedom, rather than possessing or holding freedom as a right or property. We do make possible for and with another, what we do make possible for and with another are the conditions of our freedom, of our being. And this is precisely what the allegory invites us to think about. What are the conditions for the possibility and actuality of freedom that we make for and with one another? It is this question concerning freedom that motivates Arendt's essay and, in effect, her entire philosophical project. The question and Arendt's response takes us to the heart of our exploration of being together, as it compels us to recognize the responsibility each generation has towards the ones that will follow. The question concerning the conditions of freedom is not simply raised as a matter of how we today are getting along, but represents the most fundamental question regarding our relation to one another in the world. It is both the most historical and transcendental question, for it takes us straight into the specificity of our experiment here and now, yet appeals to our memories of the most distant past and hopes for the most distant future. The question is the most fundamental question of learning, for with it we find ourselves face to face with the manner of our relationship with being and beings. Our response to the question concerning the conditions for the possibility and actuality of our freedom characterizes our responses to the call of learning. For Arendt, the question is taken up as an urgent matter of cultivating the conditions for the possibility and actuality of spontaneity and creativity, natality. She correctly identifies education as the relational activity, whether this matter is taken up or not. And further, she identifies the crux of the matter to be, quote, the relation between grown-ups and children in general, or putting it even more general and in exact terms, our attitude toward the fact of natality, the fact that we have all come into the world by being born, and that this world is constantly renewed through birth. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token save it from that ruin which, except for the coming of the new and young, would be inevitable. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world." Unquote. There's much to be unpacked from this powerful statement that concludes Arendt's essay. For the moment, we focus on the two ends: the relation between old-timers and newcomers, or grown-ups and children, and the task of renewing a common world. Together, they identify the relational as the essential matter at hand. And with the context of the allegory, these two ends correspond to the first and final parts of the story. Thus, to understand part one of the tale, we import this Arendtian view on the relation between old-timers and newcomers, an asymmetrical relationship that prepares the way for the task of renewing a common world, and corresponds to the first and final parts of the stories. Thus, to understand part one of the tale, we import this Arendtian view of the relation between old-timers and newcomers, an asymmetrical relationship that prepares the way for the task of renewing a common world, a task that is undertaken if and only if symmetrical relations are actualized. And that's how it ends. And I reread a sentence that actually somehow was, I wrote it twice, or typed it out twice. I don't know why I did that. Yeah, you know, it's interesting because when I saw that it was unanticipated, this move to Arendt, but not unexpected. That is to say, in the commentary I made yesterday, it was pretty clear that, you know, I was drawing on Arendtian metaphors and language to describe what I call the truth of concealment. So it's really from Arendt that I learned this idea of the necessity of the ground and this place of shelter, so to speak, where we're sustained and where we're renewed and when we're energized. So if you think of the fertile ground, and it's appropriate at this time of the year, it's springtime in the northeastern parts of the United States, that we see life coming back, right? And so the crocus flowers blooming, and they arrive from now the softened ground that is always sort of fertile and therefore giving birth to the new. So springtime is the time of renewal, it's the time of rebirth, and in talking about the preparation, or the question concerning the preparation of for learning, I drew upon Arendt's notion of the necessary relationship between a space where we are fertilized, if you will, or the fertile ground from which we arrive. Without a fertile ground that remains hidden, right? So we can't see underneath the ground. All we see is what comes from it. And from this ground, this necessary ground that remains hidden, we see the new appearing. And so it's not surprising to me that I moved into a discussion of Arendt and the crisis of education in order to give further exploration and further examination of this notion of the truth of concealment. So, yeah, and I think that pretty much I'm going to now, I know from glancing at it that I'm going to go on to talk about natality and why natality is, following Arendt, something that in a formal educational setting is preserved insofar as it is slowly developed. For Arendt, we have to allow for what our capacity for bringing something new into the world to be slowly developed, right? So we can't just enact that freedom. It's something that we need to slowly learn how to use, really, is what she understands as the purpose of education. And its purpose, though, ultimately is going to be directed towards what she calls repair renewal of the world. So there's this almost teleology in Arendt's idea of what we do when we're free, and what education should be aiming us towards. Now, I've worked a lot of this out in an essay, several pieces that I've written, but specifically a piece that I wrote for Teachers College Record, which so happens to be on my desk here, Educational Thinking and the Conservation of the Revolutionary. So I may link this up on the blog just to give some context, because I've worked out a lot of more of what, and this was written in 2008, actually. It was ultimately published in 2010. But it was written sometime after this material, about 4 years later. Right. So I'm going to leave it at that. You know, the introduction of Arendt and how it follows from the discussion of the truth of concealment. And this is going to be then one of the most brief of the recordings, only 12 minutes long.